Marcus Chen watched the cargo bay doors slide open, revealing a landscape that would have made most sentient beings in the galaxy soil themselves in terror. Purple-tinged atmosphere swirled with what the ship's sensors cheerfully reported as highly corrosive particulates. Lightning cracked through toxic clouds that hung low over a terrain of jagged crystalline formations and bubbling pools of something that definitely wasn't water. "This is your destination," announced Captain Vextar, his 4 eyes blinking in what Marcus had learned was the Zentharai equivalent of nervous laughter. Class 1-2 Deathworld designation Karthos. The Galactic Council has determined this to be your rehabilitation location. Marcus shouldered his small backpack and checked his water bottle one last time. 3 days of water, some energy bars, a basic first aid kit, and his grandfather's old camping knife. Not exactly what most people would consider adequate preparation for being marooned on a planet where everything wanted to kill you. No environmental suit? No beacon? No emergency shelter? He asked, though he already knew the answer. "The terms of your sentence were quite specific," Vextar replied, mandibles clicking with what passed for bureaucratic satisfaction among his species. "Survival training on a hostile world with minimal resources. The Council believes this will adjust your perspective on the value of galactic peace." Marcus had punched a Krallic diplomat at a trade conference. In his defense, the 7-foot-tall reptilian had been explaining how humans were too soft and primitive to handle real challenges, how they needed constant protection and couldn't survive without their technology. The punch had been purely educational. "How long?" Marcus asked. "Extraction in 30 standard days. If you survive." Vextar paused. "The previous occupant lasted 14 hours. What happened to him?" "Acid rain dissolved his protective gear. Then the crystal wolves found what was left." Marcus nodded and stepped toward the ramp. The air that hit him was thick and tasted like copper pennies mixed with ozone. His eyes watered slightly from the particulates. But it wasn't unbearable, like being downwind of a steel foundry on a humid day. "Any advice?" he called back. Vextar's 4 eyes widened. "Find shelter immediately. Avoid the pools. Don't touch the crystal formations. The local fauna considers everything edible, including you. The flora is either poisonous, explosive, or both. The weather patterns are," he consulted his tablet, "catastrophically unpredictable." "Got it. Basically camping in Australia, but with aliens." The Zenthari captain tilted his head, confused by the reference, then sealed the ship. Marcus watched it lift off, leaving him alone on a world that had apparently killed every previous visitor. He stood still for several minutes, letting his senses adjust. The gravity was about 1.2 standard. Noticeable but manageable. The air was breathable, if unpleasant. Temperature felt like a warm spring day back on Earth, maybe 75 degrees. The light from the local star was slightly redder than Sol, making everything look like it was filmed through an old camera filter. Marcus pulled out his water bottle and took a small sip, then began walking toward what looked like a rock formation about half a mile away. As he walked, he made mental notes of his surroundings. The ground was mostly solid, a dark soil mixed with fragments of the same crystal formations that jutted from the earth like frozen lightning. Some of the crystals hummed softly when the wind passed through them. Marcus gave them a wide berth, remembering Vextar's warning. Small creatures scurried between the crystal outcroppings. They looked like a cross between lizards and crabs, about the size of house cats, with shells that seemed to shift color depending on what they were near. Camouflage, probably. Smart little things. The first pool he encountered was indeed bubbling, a vivid green that reminded him of antifreeze. The air above it shimmered with heat. And when he tossed a small rock into it, the stone dissolved with a satisfying fizz. Acid, just as advertised. "Note to self," he muttered. "Don't go swimming." As he approached the rock formation, Marcus realized it wasn't entirely natural. There were too many straight lines, too many right angles, ruins of some kind, worn smooth by time and the planet's hostile environment. Perfect. The ruins turned out to be the remains of what might have been a research station or small colony. Most of the structure had been reclaimed by the planet, but there were still a few walls standing and what looked like it might have been a basement or underground section. Marcus climbed down through a gap in the floor, using his phone's flashlight to explore. The air was cooler down here, and much less corrosive. The walls were some kind of metal alloy that had resisted the planet's attempts to dissolve everything. There were even what looked like storage compartments built into the walls. "Home sweet home," he said, setting down his pack. The basement was about 20 feet square, with a ceiling high enough that he could stand upright. There was evidence that whoever built this place had known what they were doing. Drainage channels had been carved into the floor to handle flooding, and the entrance was positioned to minimize exposure to the elements. Marcus spent the rest of the first day making the place habitable. He cleared debris, checked for structural integrity, and set up his sleeping bag in the driest corner. As the local star began to set, he climbed back to the surface to see what evening brought to this charming world. The sunset was actually beautiful, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold that would have been spectacular under other circumstances. Then the temperature began to drop, and Marcus understood why the previous occupant hadn't lasted long. It went from 75 degrees to near freezing in less than an hour. Frost began forming on the crystal formations, which responded by emitting a low, harmonious hum that gradually increased in volume. The sound wasn't unpleasant, actually rather soothing, but it was definitely getting louder. That's when the crystal wolves arrived. Marcus saw them first as movement in his peripheral vision. They emerged from behind the larger crystal formations, like shadows given substance. They were roughly wolf-sized, but that's where the similarity ended. Their bodies seemed to be made of the same crystal material as the formations, translucent and faceted, refracting the last rays of sunlight into rainbow patterns across the ground. There were 6 of them, moving with the fluid grace of predators who knew they were apex. They didn't approach directly, instead circling his position while keeping their distance. Testing. Learning. Marcus climbed back down into his basement hideout and listened to them moving around above. Their claws clicked against the stone and crystal, a sound like wind chimes made of broken glass. They didn't seem particularly interested in digging him out, at least not yet. More like they were marking territory, letting him know who owned this neighborhood. After about an hour, they moved on, leaving Marcus alone with the sound of the wind and the increasingly loud humming of the crystals. He ate one of his energy bars and took another small sip of water, then settled in for what promised to be an interesting night. Sleep came surprisingly easily. The crystal song was actually quite relaxing once you got used to it, and the underground chamber stayed at a comfortable temperature. Marcus had slept in worse places during his years as a geological surveyor, before he'd gotten into the interstellar trade business that had eventually led him here. He was awakened before dawn by the sound of rain. Not just any rain, but the acid rain Vextar had warned him about. It hissed and bubbled when it hit the crystal formations, sending up clouds of steam that glowed faintly in the pre-dawn darkness. The smell was like a combination of hot metal and burning plastic. Marcus checked his shelter's drainage system and was pleased to see it working exactly as intended. Whoever had built this place had definitely dealt with acid rain before. The runoff was channeled away from the living area and directed toward what looked like a natural sinkhole about 50 yards away. The rain lasted most of the morning, giving him time to take inventory and plan his next moves. Water was going to be his biggest problem. He had maybe 2 days left in his bottle, and he hadn't seen any obvious sources of drinkable water. The acid pools were definitely out, and the rain itself would probably kill him if he tried to collect it directly. Food was also going to be an issue, but less immediately. He had enough energy bars for about a week, if he was careful. And there might be edible life on this planet. The little lizard crabs looked plump and well-fed, which suggested there was a food chain here. Of course, figuring out what was safe to eat without poisoning himself was going to be a challenge. When the rain finally stopped, Marcus ventured back to the surface to assess the damage. The acid rain had cleaned everything with the efficiency of industrial solvent. The crystal formations gleamed like they'd been polished, and the air was cleaner than it had been the day before. Even his own footprints from yesterday had been erased. The little lizard crabs were already venturing out, apparently unbothered by the rain that would have killed most unprotected life. Marcus watched them for a while, noting their behavior patterns. They seemed to feed on something that grew in the cracks between crystals, a moss-like substance that glowed faintly blue-green. Curious, Marcus approached one of the larger crystal formations to get a better look at the moss. Up close, he could see that it wasn't really moss at all, but some kind of primitive plant life that had adapted to this harsh environment. It grew in thick mats wherever it could find purchase, and it seemed to be the foundation of the local ecosystem. One of the lizard crabs approached while he was examining the plant life. It didn't seem particularly afraid of him, just cautious. Marcus held still and let it get used to his presence. After a few minutes, it went back to feeding, apparently deciding he wasn't an immediate threat. "You guys have the right idea," Marcus said softly. "Find what works and stick with it." He spent the rest of the day exploring his immediate area, always staying within sight of his shelter. The ruins extended further than he'd initially realized, with evidence of what might have been gardens or cultivation areas. Interesting. Someone had tried to establish a permanent settlement here. The crystal formations weren't random either. The more he looked, the more patterns he could see. They were arranged in what looked like deliberate configurations, possibly for some kind of energy collection or distribution system. The humming grew louder or softer depending on where he stood, and the frequency changed throughout the day as the star moved across the sky. As evening approached, Marcus made a discovery that changed everything. Hidden beneath overgrown vegetation in what had once been the settlement's central area, he found a water collection system. It was elegant in its simplicity. Curved metal surfaces were arranged to collect moisture from the air and channel it into underground cisterns. The system was still functional, protected from the acid rain by its design, and built from materials that could withstand the planet's corrosive environment. Marcus followed the water channels underground and found 3 large storage tanks, each about the size of a hot tub. 2 were empty, their contents long since evaporated or consumed, but the third still held several hundred gallons of clean, clear water. He tested it carefully, first with a tiny taste, then a small sip, then a full mouthful. It was good water, better than what came out of the taps in most spaceports. The ancient filtration system was apparently still working, drawing moisture from the air and purifying it through a process he didn't fully understand but definitely appreciated. "Well," Marcus said to the empty chamber, "that's problem number 1 solved." As if in response to his optimism, the crystal wolves returned. But this time, they weren't alone. Marcus heard them first, the familiar clicking of crystal claws on stone. But underneath that sound was something else. Something that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. A deep, thrumming vibration that seemed to come from everywhere at once. He climbed carefully to the surface and peered out through the ruins. The crystal wolves were there, 6 of them arranged in a perfect circle around one of the larger crystal formations. But they weren't moving, weren't hunting. They were singing. The thrumming sound was coming from them, a harmonic resonance that matched the frequency of the crystal formation. As Marcus watched, the crystal began to glow, soft at first, then brighter, until it was casting rainbow light across the entire area. And that's when he saw the big one. It emerged from behind the largest crystal formation like a living mountain. Where the crystal wolves were the size of regular wolves, this thing was the size of a bus. Its body was made of the same translucent crystal material, but it was ancient, its facets worn smooth by countless years. When it moved, it was with the ponderous grace of something that had never needed to hurry because nothing on this world could threaten it. The crystal titan approached the formation where the wolves were singing and added its own voice to their choir. The sound was incredible, a harmony that seemed to resonate in Marcus's bones. All around them, other crystal formations began to light up in response, creating a network of glowing nodes stretching out into the darkness. Marcus realized he was witnessing something extraordinary. This wasn't just animal behavior. This was a form of communication. The crystal creatures were part of the planet's ecosystem in a way that went far beyond simple predator and prey relationships. They were its nervous system, its method of sharing information across vast distances. The light show continued for almost an hour, then gradually faded as the creatures dispersed. The crystal titan was the last to leave, and for a moment, Marcus could have sworn it looked directly at him before disappearing back into the crystal maze. He spent the rest of the night thinking about what he'd seen. This planet wasn't just a death world. It was a living system. And the crystal creatures weren't just predators. They were its caretakers. The ruins he was sheltering in weren't the remains of invaders or conquerors. They were the remnants of someone who had tried to understand and work with the planet rather than against it. By his third day, Marcus had established a routine: morning exploration, afternoon maintenance, and improvement of his shelter, evening observation of the crystal creatures. He'd found more evidence of the previous settlement's integration with the planet's systems. Solar collectors that worked in harmony with the crystal formations. Gardens designed around the natural growth patterns of the local plant life. Waste processing systems that fed directly into the planet's own recycling mechanisms. Whoever had lived here before hadn't tried to terraform the planet or force it to accommodate human needs. They'd adapted themselves to work within its existing systems. It was brilliant, and it was probably why some of their infrastructure was still functional after what appeared to be decades or even centuries of abandonment. Marcus was beginning to understand why they called this a death world. It wasn't because the planet was inherently hostile to life. It was because most species approached it with the assumption that they needed to conquer it rather than cooperate with it. The acid rain, the crystal wolves, the corrosive atmosphere, they were all part of a defensive system designed to keep out organisms that couldn't or wouldn't adapt. But humans, Marcus was beginning to realize, were very good at adapting. On his fourth morning, he made first contact with the lizard crabs. Not intentionally, but it happened anyway. One of them had gotten caught in a tangle of metal debris near the water collection system. It was struggling to free itself, growing more exhausted with each failed attempt. Marcus approached slowly, speaking in soft, calming tones the way he might approach a frightened animal back home. The creature watched him with eyes that seemed far too intelligent for its size, but it didn't try to flee when he reached out to help. The debris came away easily once Marcus figured out the right angle. The lizard crab sat still for a moment, apparently assessing whether it had been injured, then looked up at Marcus with what he could only describe as gratitude before scurrying away. 2 hours later, it was back. Not alone this time, but with 3 others. They approached his shelter cautiously, staying just at the edge of what Marcus had started thinking of as his territory. One of them was carrying something in its mouth. Marcus sat down near the entrance to his shelter and waited. After a few minutes of silent negotiation among themselves, the leader approached and dropped its burden near Marcus's feet. It was one of the blue-green moss plants. But this one was different, bigger, more vibrant, and when Marcus touched it, his fingers came away slightly damp. Water moss. They'd brought him water moss. "Thank you," Marcus said simply. The lizard crabs chittered among themselves in what sounded like conversation, then dispersed. But from that day forward, they were regular visitors. Not pets, exactly, but neighbors. They'd bring him interesting things they'd found, and in return, he'd share small pieces of his energy bars, or help when one of them got into trouble. Marcus was beginning to feel at home. By the end of his first week, Marcus had turned his underground shelter into something resembling a proper living space. The lizard crabs, who he'd started calling the neighbors, had shown him where to find different varieties of the water moss. Some stored moisture better than others, and a few even had a pleasant, slightly sweet taste that reminded him of cucumber. He'd also figured out the crystal formation's schedule. The humming wasn't random. It was a daily cycle that corresponded to atmospheric conditions, temperature changes, and even seismic activity. The crystals were essentially a planet-wide early warning system, and once you learned to read them, you could predict everything from acid rain to minor earthquakes. The crystal wolves had started treating him as part of the landscape. They'd patrol through his area every few days, but they no longer circled threateningly. If anything, they seemed mildly curious about his modifications to the ancient settlement. Marcus had been careful not to disturb their paths or interfere with their routine, and they appeared to appreciate the consideration. On day 8, Marcus made his first major breakthrough. While exploring the furthest extent of the ruins, he discovered what had once been a greenhouse. The structure was mostly intact, its transparent walls made from the same crystal material that formed naturally on the planet. But unlike the wild formations, these crystals had been shaped and arranged to create optimal growing conditions. The greenhouse was about the size of a tennis court, with raised beds arranged in geometric patterns that maximized light exposure. Most of the original plants were long dead, but Marcus could see evidence of what had once been a thriving agricultural system. More importantly, some of the infrastructure was still functional. Water pipes, made from what looked like crystallized organic matter, still connected to the main collection system. Environmental controls, carved from living crystal, still responded to touch and could adjust temperature, humidity, and light levels within the structure. It was bioengineering on a scale Marcus had never imagined, technology that worked with the planet rather than imposing foreign systems upon it. Marcus spent 3 days studying the greenhouse before he worked up the courage to try restarting it. The control interface was intuitive once you understood the underlying principles. Touch here for more humidity. Trace this pattern for temperature adjustment. Sing these notes to activate the growth enhancers. Yes, sing. The discovery that certain tonal frequencies could activate the crystal technology had been accidentally made when Marcus was humming while working. The crystalline controls had suddenly flared to life, responding to harmonics in his voice. It made sense, given what he'd observed about the crystal creatures and their musical communication. Within days of reactivating the greenhouse, things began happening. The soil, which had looked barren and lifeless, began showing signs of dormant seeds responding to the improved conditions. Tiny green shoots pushed through the earth, reaching toward the crystal ceiling that filtered and amplified the star's light. The neighbors were fascinated by Marcus's activities. They'd gather at the greenhouse entrance, chattering among themselves in their complex language of clicks and chirps. Marcus got the impression they'd never seen the facility operational, which meant it had been dormant since before their species had evolved intelligence. He was witnessing the awakening of technology that predated current civilization on this world. 2 weeks in, Marcus faced his first real crisis. The energy bars were running low, and while the water moss provided hydration, it wasn't enough nutrition to sustain a human long-term. He needed to find protein, and preferably something that wouldn't kill him in the process. The neighbors seemed to understand his dilemma. They'd been watching him ration his food with what appeared to be concern. On the morning of day 15, they arrived with gifts that were different from their usual offerings of interesting rocks and water moss. The leader, who Marcus had started calling Chief due to the distinctive crest of spines along its back, deposited a small pile of what looked like nuts or seeds near the greenhouse entrance. They were about the size of acorns, with hard shells that had a slightly metallic sheen. Marcus examined them carefully. They smelled nutty and pleasant, with no obvious signs of toxicity. But he'd learned enough about alien ecosystems to be cautious. Instead of trying them directly, he decided to run some tests. He ground up a small portion and mixed it with water, watching for any unusual chemical reactions. Nothing dangerous happened, so he touched a tiny amount to his tongue. It tasted like a cross between almonds and cashews, with a slight mineral aftertaste that wasn't unpleasant. After waiting several hours for any adverse reactions, Marcus tried a slightly larger sample. His digestive system handled it fine, and the nutritional value seemed substantial. The neighbors had brought him exactly what he needed. The next challenge was finding a renewable source. Chief and the others were willing to share, but Marcus didn't want to become dependent on their generosity. He needed to understand where the nuts came from and whether he could harvest them himself. The answer, as it turned out, was literally growing under his feet. The nut trees were part of the greenhouse's original ecosystem. The dormant seeds in the soil weren't just random vegetation. They were the remains of a carefully planned agricultural system designed to provide complete nutrition for whoever had built the settlement. As the greenhouse continued to come back to life, Marcus began to see the full scope of what the original inhabitants had accomplished. This wasn't just a research station or small colony. It was a fully integrated ecosystem designed to support long-term human habitation while maintaining perfect harmony with the planet's existing systems. The nut trees began sprouting within days of the system's reactivation. But they weren't growing alone. The greenhouse was revealing itself to be a complex web of symbiotic relationships. Flowering vines that attracted local pollinators, root vegetables that thrived in the planet's unique soil chemistry, fruit trees that produced something remarkably similar to apples, if apples could survive in acid rain and corrosive atmospheric conditions. Marcus realized he was witnessing the resurrection of humanity's first successful adaptation to a Class 1-2 Deathworld. The original settlers hadn't failed because the planet killed them. They'd succeeded so completely that they'd become part of its ecosystem. Their technology hadn't been destroyed. It had been integrated so seamlessly that it appeared natural. By week 3, Marcus was no longer just surviving, he was thriving. The greenhouse was producing enough food to feed a small community. The water collection system was operating at full efficiency, providing more clean water than one person could use. His shelter had been expanded and improved, using techniques learned from studying the original construction. The neighbors had become genuine partners in his activities. They'd learned to recognize different plants, and would bring him samples of anything unusual they found during their foraging expeditions. In return, Marcus had started leaving small portions of greenhouse produce where they could find them. It was a fair trade that benefited everyone involved. The crystal wolves had also changed their behavior around him. Instead of just tolerating his presence, they'd begun including his territory in their regular patrol routes. Marcus suspected they understood that he was restoring something important, something that benefited the planet's overall health. The big discovery came on day 19. While expanding the root cellar beneath his shelter, Marcus broke through into a chamber he hadn't known existed. It was larger than his original hideout, with walls covered in what looked like carved murals depicting the history of the settlement. The images told a story of cooperation and gradual integration. The first panels showed humans arriving in environmental suits, struggling against the planet's hostile conditions. But as the story progressed, the humans changed. Their technology adapted. Their appearance evolved. By the final panels, they were no longer recognizable as the species that had first landed, but they were still human. Just human as the planet had shaped them to be. Taller, with skin that could handle corrosive atmospheres, eyes adapted to the shifted spectrum of the local star, hands that could interface directly with crystal technology. They'd become something new while remaining fundamentally themselves. The last panel was the most interesting. It showed the evolved humans working alongside creatures that Marcus recognized as the ancestors of the current crystal wolves and lizard crabs. But in the mural, they weren't just animals, they were partners. Intelligent species working together to maintain the planet's ecosystem. Marcus sat in that chamber for hours, processing what he was seeing. This wasn't just the ruins of a human settlement. It was evidence of humanity's first successful adaptation to a truly alien world. The original colonists hadn't been defeated by the planet. They'd transcended their original limitations and become something greater. The implications were staggering. If the story in the murals was accurate, then humans had been on this world for far longer than anyone in the Galactic Council realized. The current crystal creatures weren't just native life. They were the descendants of the original ecosystem that humans had helped to nurture and protect. That night, Marcus experienced the planet's communication network from the inside. The crystal wolves arrived for their evening song. But this time, they approached his shelter directly. Chief and several other neighbors were with them, forming a circle that included Marcus as he sat at the entrance to his underground home. When the singing began, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced before. A sense of connection, of belonging to something larger than himself. The harmonics weren't just beautiful, they were meaningful. Information was being shared, decisions being made, the health of the ecosystem being monitored and maintained. And somehow, impossible as it seemed, Marcus could understand fragments of it. Not the details, but the emotional content. The crystal creatures were welcoming him not as an intruder who had been tolerated, but as a returning family member who had been missed. The greenhouse had reached full productivity by the start of his 4th week. Marcus was harvesting fresh vegetables, ripe fruits, and protein-rich nuts on a daily basis. The variety was impressive, and everything was perfectly suited to human nutritional needs while thriving in the planet's unique environment. He'd also made contact with what appeared to be the planet's primary intelligence network, the Crystal Titans, who he'd only seen occasionally, had begun visiting his settlement regularly. They didn't approach directly, but they'd stand among the larger formations and observe his activities with what seemed like approval. During one of these visits, Marcus decided to try an experiment. He approached one of the Titans slowly, singing the harmonic patterns he'd learned from listening to the evening communications. The massive creature turned its attention to him, and for a moment, Marcus felt a presence in his mind that was ancient, wise, and utterly alien. Images flashed through his consciousness. The planet as it had been millions of years ago, the arrival of the first humans, the slow process of adaptation and integration, the success of the project, and the decision to let the outside galaxy believe the colony had failed, protecting the adapted humans and their crystalline partners from interference. The contact lasted only seconds, but it left Marcus with a profound understanding of his situation. He wasn't just surviving on this planet. He was being evaluated as a potential candidate for the same transformation that had created the original adapted population. The question was whether he wanted to accept that transformation, whether he was willing to become something more than human in order to become truly human in the context of this world. Marcus spent his final week on Carthos considering that question. He continued his work with the greenhouse, expanded his understanding of the planet's systems, and deepened his relationships with the local inhabitants. Every day, he felt more at home in this place that the galaxy had labeled as unsurvivable. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd been sent here as punishment, to teach him humility and respect for the dangers of the galaxy. Instead, he'd found a place where humanity had achieved something remarkable. A synthesis of technology and nature that transcended the limitations of both. As his 30-day sentence neared its end, Marcus realized he was facing a choice that would determine not just his own future, but potentially the future of human relationships with the rest of the galaxy. The Galactic Council thought they knew what humans were capable of. They had no idea how wrong they were. On his final night before the scheduled extraction, Marcus sat in his garden, surrounded by the neighbors and watched by the Crystal Titans, listening to the planet sing its ancient songs of growth and harmony. Tomorrow, Captain Vextar would return to find either a humbled survivor who had learned his lesson about the dangers of the galaxy, or something that would change everything they thought they knew about the universe. The choice was his to make. Captain Vextar's ship dropped out of hyperspace exactly 30 standard days after he'd deposited the human prisoner on Carthos. He was accompanied this time by a full survey team, including xenoarchaeologists, biologists, and a medical unit prepared to treat whatever remained of Marcus Chen after a month on the galaxy's most notoriously hostile world. The bridge crew maintained their usual professional demeanor, but Vextar could sense their underlying nervousness. None of them expected to find anything more than bones, assuming the acid rains and predators had left even that much. The betting pool among the lower decks had the human lasting maybe a week, which was optimistic compared to most previous attempts at Class 1-2 survival. "Beginning orbital scan," announced his sensor operator, a young Zenthari named Clix, who was still enthusiastic about deep space assignments. "Searching for human life signs, or remains." Vextar settled into his captain's chair and reviewed the mission parameters on his tablet. Straightforward prisoner retrieval, with a secondary mandate to document whatever had killed this particular human for future reference. The Galactic Council maintained detailed records of Class 1-2 mortality rates as part of their ongoing study of Deathworld ecosystems. "Captain," Clix's voice carried a note of confusion that made Vextar look up from his reading. "I'm getting some unusual readings from the surface." "Define unusual." "Well, sir, I'm detecting human life signs. Strong ones. And..." Clix paused, checking his instruments again. "The planetary energy grid appears to be significantly more active than our previous scans indicated." Vextar moved to the sensor station and looked at the displays himself. The readings were indeed unusual. Not only was Marcus Chen apparently still alive, but the planet's crystalline formation network was showing energy patterns that suggested full activation. That was supposed to be impossible. The last confirmed activation had been over 2 centuries ago, and it had taken the combined efforts of multiple research teams working for decades. "Are you certain these readings are accurate?" "Double-checked, sir. The energy grid is definitely active, and there's definitely a human down there. In fact, Clicks made some adjustments to the sensors and frowned at the results. "Captain, I'm reading multiple signatures that appear to be human technology, but they're integrated with the natural crystal formations. That shouldn't be possible." Dr. Shanti, the mission's chief xenobiologist, leaned over Clix's shoulder to examine the readings. She was a Vorthan, a species known for their analytical precision and skeptical nature. These energy patterns suggest not just activation, but optimization. The entire grid is operating at efficiency levels we've never recorded. Could the human have somehow triggered this? Vextar asked. Absolutely not. Dr. Shanti replied with the certainty typical of her species. Human technology is completely incompatible with Karthos crystal systems. The previous research teams tried for decades to establish even basic interface protocols. A single human, without equipment, surviving for 30 days, while simultaneously activating planetary systems that have defeated our best scientists is. She paused, her analytical mind struggling with the impossibility of what the sensors were telling them. Is what, Doctor? Is impossible, Captain. Vextar made a decision that would later be studied in xenological departments across the galaxy. Instead of sending down an automated probe or requesting backup, he ordered a full landing party to investigate personally. Science officers, security personnel, medical technicians, and cultural specialists, all loaded into the ship's primary shuttle for what was supposed to be a routine body retrieval. The shuttle descended through Karthos's notorious atmosphere, with the entire crew watching the sensor displays in growing amazement. As they broke through the cloud layer, they could see the crystal formations spread across the landscape below, all of them glowing with active energy patterns. The sight was breathtaking and theoretically impossible. There, Dr. Shanti pointed toward a section of the continent that showed the highest concentration of activity. The human signals are originating from that area. But Captain, I'm also detecting at least 40 other life forms in the immediate vicinity. Crystal wolves? Vextar asked grimly. Those predators were the primary reason most Class 1-2 survivors didn't last more than a few days. Some, yes, but also species I don't recognize from our previous surveys. And they're all congregating around the human's location. The shuttle set down in a clearing about half a mile from the energy concentration, following standard safety protocols for hostile environment landings. The crew deployed in full environmental suits, armed with emergency beacons and protective field generators. As they approached the source of the readings, Vextar began to understand that everything they thought they knew about humans was about to change. The first thing they saw was the garden. It stretched across several acres of what their surveys had documented as barren wasteland, filled with plants that were somehow thriving in an environment that should have killed them instantly. Neat rows of vegetables, fruit trees heavy with produce, and grain plots that were ready for harvest created a landscape of impossible abundance. This violates approximately 17 fundamental principles of xenobiology, Dr. Shanti whispered, taking readings with every instrument at her disposal. The second thing they saw was the infrastructure. What their surveys had recorded as random crystal formations were actually part of a sophisticated technology network. Water collection systems, environmental controls, energy distribution nodes, and communication arrays, all working in perfect harmony with the planet's natural ecosystem. But the third thing they saw was what made even the most skeptical members of the crew question their understanding of reality. Marcus Chen was sitting in the middle of it all, surrounded by dozens of creatures that should have killed him weeks ago. Crystal wolves lounged nearby like domesticated pets. The small lizard-like beings that had never shown anything but hostile behavior toward off-world visitors were bringing him food and tools. And in the distance, clearly visible despite their massive size, crystal titans stood among the larger formations, like ancient guardians overseeing a successful experiment. Marcus looked up as the landing party approached, waved casually, and called out, "You're a bit early." I wasn't expecting pickup until this afternoon. The entire survey team stopped dead. This wasn't the behavior of a survivor who had endured 30 days of hell on the galaxy's most dangerous planet. This was the behavior of someone who was comfortable, healthy, and perfectly at home. Captain Vextar was the first to recover his voice. "Mr. Chen, you appear to be, well, never better. Actually, Marcus replied, standing up from where he'd been harvesting some kind of blue fruit. Would you like a tour? I think you'll find the setup here pretty interesting. Dr. Shanti stepped forward, her instruments beeping frantically as they tried to process readings that shouldn't exist. Mr. Chen, how exactly did you manage to activate the planetary grid? Our best research teams have been unable to establish even basic communication with the crystal systems. Marcus looked genuinely puzzled by the question. You mean the singing? It's not that complicated once you understand the harmonics. Here, let me show you. What happened next would be recorded in xenological databases as the first documented case of spontaneous human crystal interface achievement. Marcus approached one of the smaller crystal formations and began producing a series of tonal patterns with his voice. The crystal immediately responded, glowing brighter and adjusting its harmonic frequency to match his vocalizations. You just have to listen first, Marcus explained as the landing party stared in stunned silence. They're not really different from us. They just communicate differently. Once you learn the basic patterns, you can interface with the whole network. One of the crystal wolves approached the group, and several security personnel reached for their weapons. Marcus made a calming gesture and knelt down beside the creature, which nuzzled against his hand like an overgrown puppy. This is Echo, Marcus said, scratching behind what might have been the creature's ears. She's been helping me understand the local ecosystem. Turns out they're not predators in the way we thought. They're more like ecosystem engineers. The whole planet is essentially one big cooperative organism. Dr. Shanti was frantically taking notes and sensor readings, trying to document what was clearly the xenological discovery of the century. Mr. Chen, these creatures have killed every previous visitor to this planet. How did you establish this relationship? I listened to them first, Marcus repeated. And I didn't try to impose my ideas about how things should work. I learned their system, instead of trying to replace it with mine. Captain Vextar was beginning to understand the implications of what he was witnessing. This wasn't just a remarkable survival story. This was evidence that humans were capable of achievements that the Galactic Council had deemed impossible. If a single human could accomplish this much in 30 days, what might humanity be capable of when they really applied themselves? Mr. Chen, he said carefully, the terms of your sentence have been completed. You're free to return with us to face the remainder of your legal proceedings. Marcus was quiet for a moment, looking around at the garden he'd helped create, and the creatures who had become his partners and friends. When he spoke, his voice carried a note of decision that made everyone listening pay attention. Actually, I'd like to request a modification to my sentence. What kind of modification? Extension. Indefinite. There's work here that needs to be done, and I'm just getting started. The landing party exchanged glances. This was definitely not in their mission parameters. Dr. Shanti was practically vibrating with excitement at the research possibilities, but Captain Vextar had his orders. Mr. Chen, while your achievements here are remarkable, you're still a citizen of the Galactic Federation with legal obligations. We can't simply leave you on a Class-12 Deathworld. Why not? Marcus asked. I'm not in danger here. If anything, I'm safer than I would be in most core worlds. And the work I'm doing has implications that go far beyond my personal legal situation. He gestured toward the garden and the thriving ecosystem around them. This planet isn't a death world, it's a testing ground. The original human colonists figured that out centuries ago, and they left behind a system that can teach us how to live in harmony with environments we've always considered hostile. Marcus walked over to one of the larger crystal formations and placed his hand against its surface. The entire network responded, glowing brighter and producing a harmonic resonance that seemed to make the air itself sing. Every Class-12 world in the galaxy is probably like this, he continued. Not hostile, just selective. They're testing whether species are ready to move beyond the need to dominate and control their environment. The crystal creatures aren't trying to kill visitors. They're trying to communicate. The acid rain and toxic atmosphere aren't attacks. They're filters. Dr. Shanti looked up from her instruments with an expression of awe that transcended her usual scientific skepticism. Captain, the energy readings I'm getting suggest that Mr. Chen has achieved integration levels with this ecosystem that exceed theoretical maximums. If his hypothesis is correct, we're not looking at a single survival story. We're looking at a paradigm shift in how we understand planetary ecosystems. The implications of Marcus's words were staggering. If he was right, then the Galactic Council's entire classification system for hostile worlds was based on fundamental misunderstandings. Planets they'd written off as uninhabitable might actually be some of the most sophisticated testing grounds in the galaxy. Captain Vextar made another decision that would later be studied by command academies throughout known space. Instead of insisting on Marcus's extraction, he opened a direct communication channel to Galactic Command and requested immediate consultation with the Council's highest scientific authorities. The conversation that followed lasted 6 hours and involved xenobiologists, ecosystem specialists, diplomatic officials, and ultimately the Council President herself. Marcus demonstrated his abilities with the Crystal Network, showed them the thriving agricultural systems he'd established, and presented his theory about the true nature of Class-12 worlds. By the end of the discussion, it was clear that everything the galaxy thought it knew about these planets would need to be reconsidered. Marcus was granted not just an extension of his stay on Carthos, but official designation as the first human ambassador to a Class-12 ecosystem. Dr. Shanti requested immediate reassignment to lead a permanent research team on the planet. Captain Vextar found himself promoted to head of a new xenological survey division, specifically created to investigate other Class-12 worlds using Marcus's integration protocols. 3 months later, the first successful communication was established with a Class-12 world in the Rigel sector. 6 months after that, a permanent research colony was founded on what had previously been considered the most hostile planet in known space. Within a year, the term Deathworld was officially retired from Galactic Council terminology, replaced with Integration Challenge Worlds. Marcus Chen, the human who had been sentenced to 30 days on a hostile planet for punching a diplomat, had accidentally become the architect of a new era in galactic civilization. He'd proven that humanity's greatest strength wasn't their technology or their military capability, but their unmatched ability to adapt, integrate, and find ways to cooperate with even the most alien environments. The final report filed by Captain Vextar concluded with a note that would become famous throughout the galaxy. Human subject observed to treat Class-12 integration challenge as routine camping experience. Recommend immediate revision of all assumptions regarding human capabilities and limitations. And on Carthos, Marcus Chen continued his work with the crystal creatures and the planetary ecosystem, always remembering the day he'd complained that being stranded on a deadly alien world was just camping. He'd been more right than he knew. It really had been just camping, human style, which apparently meant turning the most dangerous planet in the galaxy into a garden and making friends with creatures that had terrified the rest of galactic civilization for centuries. In the evenings, he would sit with the neighbors and listen to the Crystal Titans sing their ancient songs, adding his own voice to harmonies that connected every living thing on the planet in a network of cooperation and understanding. It was, he often thought, exactly the kind of place humanity had always been meant to find.